How's it going, everybody? My name is Angelo, and you are watching Architecture with Angelo. Today, we're going to talk about the issues that people have with modern architecture and why it has a branding problem. So, stick around. So, we're going to start by talking about a geometric shape. The shape is not an array, rather, it's the line. So, the line is a Saudi mega project that started later this year, a few months ago. It's 110 miles long, it's several hundred feet wide. It's a linear city, and it is supposed to address a lot of the supposed modern day issues of cities. So it has everything's walkable, everything's within a few minutes of each other. There's high speed rail that connects one end of the city to another. So, again, what this is doing is it's trying to compact cities in hopes of a more sustainable future. Well, that's what they say. And this project isn't without controversy. There is ecological damage that's going to happen to the desert landscape. There is the issue of local people having property and on this area and having it being taken from them, and there's a general financial burden that it's going to impose on the kingdom. There are many issues in Saudi Arabia, economic issues, social issues, and a lot of people think that it would make more money to funnel that money to that, or maybe some kind of sovereign wealth fund for when the oil money dries up. I don't know, something like that. Instead, they choose to construct this, very sci-fi futuristic project, which might look nice, but, again, it's this rift between what the kingdom and the architects are providing and what the Saudi public actually wants. And that tension there is a real focus of what my video is going to be about, right? I mean, think about in your own life when you're driving through your local city. What are you thinking? Are you thinking, oh, that this architecture is beautiful, it's unique? Sure, there might be historic districts, there might be certain buildings that really are a testament to the local character, but a lot of the times there's this sense of placelessness. There's this idea that the same box is going to be visible in one city as another city. So there's this stripping away of the local culture and customs and traditions that make our cities special, and instead there's this imposing of this modern architecture against our own will. So part of the issue why modern architecture is so controversial is pretty obvious. I mean, the style is polarizing. There's a lot of buildings that people look at and just think they're objectively bad, and they think that the architect should be ashamed of themselves for even designing it. But there is a more subtle issue that's happening, and a lot of it is based on how we see the world and how we see unfair acquisitions of power and how we see particular political regimes articulating that power. We see this connection between what modern architecture is and the authoritarianism that oftentimes underlies it. And that relationship between modern architecture and authoritarianism is at the root of the branding problem of modern architecture, right? So to talk about this further, we need to get in our time machine here, and we need to go into the late 19th century. So at this time, cities were very chaotic, right? There was industrialization happening, there was overcrowding. In North American cities, people were coming in by boatloads from parts of Europe and parts of Asia. And so there's a lot of stuff happening. In European cities, there were these, succeeding waves of pandemics, endemics. It's the same case in the Americas too. And what happened was architects looked at that and said, we have a problem, right? We have these cities, and there's a lot of issues with them, and they're getting worse and worse by the day. So we think that architecture can solve these problems. So the question with them became, how can we channel the dynamism of industry, all the movement and economic growth that is accompanying that, and then we want to combine it with our desire to rid the cities of these dangerous germs and pathogens that are causing so much harm to the cities. So what they did was they created a style called modernism, the international style, as it was called, because it wants to blur the line between nation and community, and in hopes of creating this global aesthetic that it's very utopian in its idea, right? And one of the pioneers of this idea is Le Corbusier. He was a Swiss-French architect, and a very central idea of his is that a house is a machine for living. What do I mean by that? Well, to him, the house needed to address several elements relating to people's well-being. It needed to do so in an efficient way, in a cost-effective way. It needed to allow light in to encourage people to get, sunlight and not have these disease-ridden dark interiors. You need to have modern appliances, the latest fixtures. You need to have plenty of sinks. You need indoor plumbing. Right. So this relationship between the building and the technology really develops, and it's a consequence of both the industrialization, but also the diseases that were happening in these large cities. And then a third variable picks up, which is World War One. And what World War One does is it really asserts to these architects the need to create this international style that ignores nationalism and ignores these kind of ideas that they thought were responsible for so much of the destruction of Europe. So what they did was there were these schools that rose up. One example is the Bauhaus, and it was how can we design from a blank slate? How can we make it so that architecture now can be distinct from the past, which we correlate to all this violence and bloodshed, and instead we can have this architecture be something of a kind of utopian new future where people can live in harmony and peace and don't have to worry about a bomb going off near their apartment complex. So they thought that modern architecture was the remedy to society's ills. But what happened was, in reality, as modern architecture picked up with World War II and the almost complete destruction of many European cities, modern architecture kicked into overdrive. The kind of Mad Men 1950s modernist style that we are very accustomed with, that kind of mid-century modern look, was really, it moved from the avant-garde to the traditional, because during the interwar period, traditional architecture was still being used. It was kind of getting on life support in terms of the frequency of its use, but it was still, being employed. But after World War II, the modern architecture really, really took off. But people started noticing that their cityscapes were changing. It wasn't cathedrals that were towering over, buildings. Instead, the office tower kind of replaced the cathedral in terms of its significance to the cityscape. And some people were okay with that, but a lot of people were not. They saw their city kind of being transformed before their eyes without their express permission. Some of the issues that these people had were pretty surface level, and these issues continue to this day. They're aesthetic problems. They think that modern architecture creates placelessness. They're sick and tired of going to different cities and seeing the same office towers. If you go to Manila or if you go to Minneapolis, you're going to see a similar architectural style. Manila and Minneapolis have their own architectural heritage that is rich in complexity and all that, and they want to see that articulated in the cityscape. They don't just want to see the same glass and steel and concrete being used throughout, right? They want to see that, that uniqueness that makes a city special. Like they think, okay, I'm going to go to Italy, for example, because they've preserved so much of their architecture, and each city has its own unique character. Sure, there's overarching classical themes and whatnot, but there is still that, that fundamental manifestation of history that architecture to them should really encapsulate. It shouldn't be this blank slate way of looking at things, but instead should be a cultural accumulation of knowledge. They correlate modern architecture with shoddy construction practices. This isn't completely modern architecture's fault. There is a bias that happens when people look at old buildings that have withstood the test of time. They think that all buildings were designed like that and built like that, when in reality that's not the case. These buildings just happen to survive the test of time, and then the ones that didn't were demolished or replaced. But regardless of that, there are still inexcusable construction practices being employed by modern architecture. Part of that is kind of inevitable. So beforehand, materials like masonry, stone, they're designed to last hundreds of years. But now, with materials being, their shelf life only being a few decades before they need to be repaired or replaced, buildings there needs to be a lot of maintenance to these buildings. For example, the Pompidou Center in Paris, which is as modern as it gets, what it happens is every few decades they have to replace these different parts because these parts are exposed to weathering. The steel and the concrete and the glass, they need to be constantly maintained. You need the funds for that. So while the cost is cheaper in the short term to build like this, you need to have money set aside in order to maintain these structures. But the problem is a lot of people don't do that, and they just kind of let the buildings rot. For example, we saw the Surfside condo collapse that happened, and we saw Grenfell Tower with the fire. So what happens is people look at this and they say, okay, modern architecture, it's all like this. It's all about cutting corners. There is no beauty. It's just how can we make a building as cheap as possible? We don't care about how it connects with the surroundings. We just want to make money. So they see that and they go, oh, I'm going to dismiss architecture altogether. And the third grievance that people have is they just think it's ugly. This isn't really something that you can change, or it's just, it's just a result of the polarizing nature of the aesthetic. Instead of having buildings like the Sagrada Familia, where it's just, just so much intricate detail and monumentality and all this energy put into the design, what they see is they see this reduction in detail, this simplification of geometry that modern architecture has, and they dismiss it entirely. It just doesn't resonate with them. They think it's ugly. And there are some instances where modern architecture tries to be controversial and it tries to polarize and it does try to stand out from the surrounding architecture, which could be more traditional. So again, that's just, it sets people off. They don't like to see it in their towns. They don't like to see it in their cities. They don't like to worship in their churches. They don't like to go to school in buildings like that. That's just what they think. So we got the more surface level critiques out of the way with modern architecture. Now I want to jump into the more philosophical roots of these grievances, which I hinted to before when I talked about the connection between modern architecture and tyranny, right? And this tyranny isn't partisan or, it's not ideologically biased in one direction or another direction. Both sides get the heat from it. On the left, we see that communism really was drawn to modern architecture. In the Soviet Union, there was this artistic and architectural way of thinking. It's called constructivism. And constructivism basically wanted to create art and architecture that reflected the dynamism of industrialization, the constant impermanence that accompanies revolution, and they looked toward the agitation of the proletariat against the bourgeois as a very positive movement, mobilizing the workers and overthrowing the wealthy. So what they wanted to do was to harness that collective idea. They wanted to create an architectural style that was both energetic, but also conforming to the collective groupthink. They didn't want individual details and ornament. They just wanted a utilitarian structure that could respond to the housing needs and the economic needs of the Soviet Union, but also assert the dominance of the state as being the arbiters of what looks good and what the people should enjoy, regarding beauty, right? Beauty standards of the Soviet Union. And while constructivism specifically kind of had a short shelf life in terms of its contributions to the Soviet-built environment, modern architecture itself, as a wider concept, really becomes the defining feature of the Soviet Union. We see succeeding Soviet regimes installing in different housing policies, and the legacy of that is, in Eastern Europe and in Soviet Union and its former, satellite states. We see these white, or sometimes they like to spice them up and give them multicolors, these housing blocks that are in the state of disrepair because they've been poorly maintained. And people look at that and they say, okay, that's authoritarian, copy-paste, cookie-cutter oppression, right? And that's what modern architecture is, right? So because what the Soviet Union did was they said, okay, we want a blank slate in terms of our political ideology. We want to wipe away all the class divides and religious divides and nation divides and all that, and we want to create something new. And they thought that modern architecture would be the vessel for them to do that, which is why they were drawn to it so heavily. On the political right, however, the relationship between modern architecture and tyranny is less one-to-one. It's less obvious. A lot of that's due to the fact that many circles of philosophical thought on the right are inherently opposed to modern architecture. They feel like because they want society to revert to some earlier state, they want to turn back the clock. What they think is that modern architecture is a vessel for sin and hedonism and all the behaviors that they think that society should not encourage and should be, in some instances, illegal. So they think of traditional architecture as a pure way of looking at things. It's pure, it reflects the intellectual and cultural achievements of our ancestors, and the right holds a lot of importance in ancestors because they feel like the past is where we get our wisdom from. And if we look towards a blank slate, kind of more hedonistic way of things, it's very bad for society as a whole. However, there was some sympathy in the right, the authoritarian right, among architects that allowed for modern architecture. One particular example that I find interesting is in Italy during Mussolini's reign. So during fascist Italy, sure, there was this emphasis on tradition, family, and Catholicism and the like. But architecturally speaking, there was also this idea to channel Rome's political ambitions, right? So Italy wanted to recreate the Roman Empire. That was their goal. And they felt like, in terms of architecture, what they should do is look back to the classical era, but not in terms of the the ornament and the elaborate detailing. They wanted to strip that away. In a sense, that's because that allowed for some individualism among the Roman architects. What they want to do is they want to focus on the group, right? Because it's about taking the individual and setting them aside in favor of the state. So what they did was they had this idea. It was called rationalism, and it was looking towards the classical past for the symmetry, for the order, for all the rigid elements of classical architecture, and just having those be showcased for the built environment, having buildings look like that. It's similar to strict classicism, which takes the classical ideas and takes out all the frills and just leaves the authoritarian monolithic structure. But it's different because it was more influenced by people like Le Corbusier and the modernists of the time, right? It was also influenced by some classical artists and architects who, again, had this idealized devotion towards geometry, which it almost considered sacred. For the Italian fascists, it was a sacred devotion to the state, so it was using architecture as a way to articulate that, authoritarian impulse. But there's also the libertarian right. The libertarian right looks at modern architecture and it obviously sees it as a way to build cheaper, which is one thing, but there's also the correlation with modern architecture and corporatization. It started after World War II. It kicked into high gear, and they kicked to even higher gear during the 1980s with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and neoliberalism and the like. But basically the idea was we have this corporation which is an entity, a being, but it's the being of many components. These components are workers, and they work like little cogs of the machine. In order for the machine to work, the people need to work, and the people need to be loyal to the company, and they need to do everything in their power to make sure the company makes money. So architecture, to this neoliberal corporate idea, it's supposed to be a stage for the money making to be set, right? So you have the office tower, where everything is uniform and everything is rigid in order with the fluorescent lights and the Mad Men interior, and you have this goal, this profit motive for the worker bees to make money. Again, it's not authoritarianism to a government per se, but it's authoritarianism regardless, because it's authoritarianism to a corporation, right? So we have that on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have this more abstract embrace of corporatism, neoliberalism, free market capitalism. And that comes from parametricism. Now, you might not know what that word means, but the images that I'm showing you of the buildings, you probably recognize them. They're these very fluid compositions. You wonder, I'm often amazed when I look at these and I go, how are these buildings made? Because no human could make this. It had to be computer, right? A computer had to help in the design, and that tends to be the case, actually. So Patrick Schumacher, who heads up Zaha Hadid Architects, whose firm is one of the most famous examples of parametric buildings, says that parametricism is supposed to free architecture from the constraints of the 90-degree wall. Supposed to free them from the constraints of order. The building should be easily manipulated through computer modeling. This ability to kind of morph itself in different contexts with ease. That's a very important idea for this architectural style. But a lot of opposition to this style comes from its connection with neoliberalism itself. So there's a critic called Douglas Spencer who wrote a book called The Architecture of Neoliberalism. And what he said was that parametricism and its ability to kind of be almost like a chameleon, blending into the surrounding landscape and the surrounding context pretty seamlessly, what that does is, by making it like an organism, it's almost a manifestation of neoliberalism itself, which, it makes sense because Schumacher is a pretty ardent free market capitalist. He's very for, these policies that take government out of the way for everything and instead focus on the profit motive, right? So that kind of makes sense. But that leaves the question of, again, how do you correlate this, this kind of organic way of architecture to the economic system that surrounds it? And a lot of that comes from, you just think about who the clients are for these projects. For example, the line. You look at the concert hall in Azerbaijan, which people point to as an example of the, what parametricism gets right, but also what it gets wrong. It's this architecture that just allows itself to blend in regardless of the economic system and the tyranny that underlies that system or the political system, and instead just it just allows itself to kind of de-individualize itself in favor of the profit motive. It's just architects going in and wanting to make money, and clients wanting to make money off of that, right? It's that kind of relationship. So to Spencer and Schumacher, they probably would agree on this, even if they oppose on the conclusions of it, is that parametricism is a very organic style, and it fits in well to the economic systems of different countries around the world, regardless of whether they are friendly or unfriendly and the like. And it's indicative of a lot of issues of neoliberalism itself, right? It's this classic discrepancy between, for example, how Apple would treat its workers, and how it celebrates Pride Month. But then you look at what Foxconn is doing in China and how they treat their workers, and this company that is so important for Apple products. And again, it's this indicative nature of what companies have to do to make money under a neoliberal system, which they have to be like a chameleon. They have to just blend into the political system in order to make money, right? And modern architecture, and specifically parametricism, really embodies that idea too, right? It's about taking out the morality and ethics of it and just saying, I want to produce a great building for this client, and I want to do so and uphold and encourage the economic system that underlies it. It's this idea that as long as you go with the flow, as long as you do what you acquiesce to the societal and economic gradient of things, you're going to do okay. You're going to make money. And again, I go back to this rift between what the architects say that people want and what they actually want, right? Because people oftentimes don't really feel comfortable in this economic system. They feel like they're overworked. They feel like they have to take out all these student loans just to participate in the the domestic economy and the global economy, and they feel like again they've just lost, especially since the 1980s, they've just lost their agency in life, and the architecture surrounding them, they just have to just conform to it, and they don't feel like they have a say in how their cities look and how they get from point A to point B in life. And it's a kind of this codependent relationship, again, between parametricism and neoliberalism, free market capitalism. So we see this on the right, we see there's this authoritarian camp which says that modern architecture can be a way of simplifying rational geometric patterns and tendencies in the hopes of encouraging people to conform to what the ruler wants and acquiesce to the ruler's ambitions. But then you have on the economic side of things this idea of people just doing what the corporation wants, and the corporation takes the place of the government. And this can just be like a soulless corporate office tower, but it could be more abstract projects like those that parametric architects design, like Patrick Schumacher. And what that does is to critics, it alienates people from their architecture, from their buildings that they see, the ones that they have to interact with every single day. So it's that disconnect that really gives architecture this branding problem that the solution for is a very difficult one for people. So we've been talking about how modern architecture has this branding problem because it's correlated with the authoritarianism, the left and the right over the past 100 or so years, right? But we also, before we completely condemn modern architecture itself, we need to look at the bigger picture of things. Authoritarianism did exist before modern architecture, obviously. But how do we treat that architecture? People go to Versailles, for example, and think of it as a treasured, example of architecture and one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. And, they love all the detailing and all the effort put in, all the craftsmanship. But then they look at modern architecture by a contemporary tyrant, whether that be a communist leader or a fascist or some sort of corporation, and they kind of scoff at it and they say this is disgusting and it's dehumanizing. So why is it that we give a pass to this older style, we kind of grandfather it in, but on the other hand, we look at modern architecture and we say you don't get the same pass. We're going to condemn you wholeheartedly. And I don't have an easy answer to that. I think part of it's because of how much effort and human effort was put in to the creation of these structures. People recognize that and they appreciate it. I think that there's almost instinctual standards to what a lot of people like regarding symmetry and geometry and order and all that kind of stuff. Um, but also, again, it's just the polarizing, nature of what modern architecture is. It's this idea of stripping everything in the past and instead, building this future that is kind of just whatever the regime wants, right? But then, for example, when you look at, I don't know, like France on the mind, but if you look at the Paris Opera, right, that was built by a leader with tyrannical tendencies. But I think that a lot of it has to do with, even when the tyrants were creating these structures, the structures were designed, sure, they were designed to assert the dominance of the ruler, but there was also this acknowledgement and appreciation of the accumulated cultural achievements of the society. For example, with the Paris Opera, sure, I mean, the leader might have not been great, and sure, it was used to assert their political dominance, but at the end of the day, that building and the detailing and the craft reflects, centuries and centuries and centuries of cultural achievement and mathematical sophistication and, attention to detail and all that, intellectual accumulation is proudly put on display. So people feel proud of what they, been in the society that they've, participated in, creating such these structures that really withstand the test of time. But with modern architecture, again, you don't really see that. You see this disconnect between what people want and what the architect provides, and you see this complete separation almost from the historical context of the surroundings and how the architect designs the building. So I think that has to do a lot. I think that's a big culprit for it. It's just people. It's just these structures being manifestations of the cultural achievements, even if they were built by unfriendly political leaders. But today that's not really the case, and people see that and they're just completely put off by that.